What's up, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here, and last week I finished talking about Jason Aaron's Wolverine and the X-Men run. I spent 1 week talking about each volume, and I said I was going to keep talking about different X-Men volumes, different runs, and stuff like that, and you may have been wondering, what else am I going to talk about? Well, I figured since I went ahead and spent like 2.5 months talking about his Wolverine and the X-Men run, I would go ahead and talk about the other X-Men book that Jason Aaron worked on, Amazing X-Men: The Quest for Nightcrawler. As I understand it, as Jason Aaron was getting ready to finish working on Wolverine and the X-Men, he planned to finish working on that, but then he wanted to keep working on Amazing X-Men. And when they first planned this series, originally the plan was for both of them to go on simultaneously. I read about that somewhere, and then he was like, no, I've got too much stuff going on, I'm going to have to end Wolverine and the X-Men, but then he was like, I'm going to keep working on Amazing X-Men. And then he ends up doing just this one storyline, and then he leaves Amazing X-Men, unfortunately, because I've really been enjoying his X-Men work, and I really would have liked for him to have worked with these characters a little longer. I would have liked to have seen like 6 or 7 volumes of Amazing X-Men, kind of like he had that long of a run on Wolverine and the X-Men. So, unfortunately, this big run that I was anticipating was only the 1 volume, but this is a pretty good story. I will go ahead and say, at the very end of the Volume 7 of Wolverine and the X-Men, we get a little hint at what's going on here. And basically, Nightcrawler, he died in the events of the X-Men crossover Second Coming. And then we find out he's been in heaven this entire time, and we find out here that he's basically been miserable, and he wants to go back. And then this is kind of the events of him coming back to the X-Men, and what entails that journey from going from heaven to being back with the X-Men. And I will go ahead and say, it leaves a lot of questions in the air that are unanswered, if that makes any sense. At the very beginning, we see that he's kind of wishing that he could go back for one last hoorah, if you will. And then, at the end, I'm not sure if he's going to be the depressed Nightcrawler who wishes that he could go back to heaven, or if he's going to be the same old Nightcrawler that we all know and love. Because at the very end, he's realizing, oh, I gave up heaven to come back here. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. And I don't know if he's going to be kind of sad and angsty for a really long time to come, or if he's going to kind of quickly get back into his jolly, jovial self that he used to be. And since Jason Aaron isn't going to be working on this anymore, instead, following this volume, we've got Craig Kyle and Chris Yost working on Amazing X-Men. I don't know if they plan on following that up, or if they even plan on using Nightcrawler that much. I do know that they brought Colossus into the book, and so for all I know, they may have decided to focus on Colossus instead of Nightcrawler, because if you just read this volume, it would definitely appear like Nightcrawler is going to be the focus of the series. And of course, not too long after this started, Nightcrawler got his own solo series, and as far as I know, that's still going on. So maybe if you read this and you want to see what's it like going from being in heaven to being back on Earth, maybe you need to read the Nightcrawler book by Chris Claremont. I've heard some people say it's not really that good, especially if you like old school Chris Claremont. I've heard other people say that it's really good. I haven't read it yet. This book is a swashbuckling adventure, and that is very appropriate for a story that is focused on bringing Nightcrawler back to the fold. I will say, it doesn't really focus on Nightcrawler until the very end. The last issue kind of sort of gets into his head a lot more than the rest of this book, because this collects 6 issues, and for most of this book, like 2/3 of it, you're mostly just focused on the different X-Men being trapped in heaven or hell fighting these pirates, and you're not really seeing Nightcrawler a whole lot. He comes in and he helps them a little bit, but it's not really until the end of the book, the last 1 or 2 issues, that you kind of start to get into his head. And this is going to be a little bit of a spoiler if you haven't read this book, but it kind of appears that Nightcrawler may have lost his soul in the process of coming back to Earth, because we find out, if you've been reading Wolverine and the X-Men, there are these Bamfs, which are these little miniature Nightcrawlers, and all they can say is the word Bamf and sometimes the word whiskey. And they were in the Wolverine and the X-Men book kind of just a little menace, kind of like Cornish pixies from the Harry Potter movies, one of those movies, kind of like that, and we never really knew where they came from. Well, this book finally explains where they came from, and we find out there are red Bamfs who serve Nightcrawler's father Azazel, and then the blue Bamfs kind of serve Nightcrawler, and it leaves a lot of questions in the air, like I said, because we find out where the Bamfs come from. Azazel had fed his blood to these maggot creatures from hell, and then they transformed into little miniature versions of Azazel, and we know where they came from, And then Nightcrawler kind of sort of tells the story of where the blue ones came from, where he found one of the red ones, and then he offered him something, and then somehow that turned into all of the blue vamps. I don't really know how he got one red vamp and then he got a whole bunch of blue vamps. That doesn't really make any sense. And then I don't even know if the vamps are still around the school at the end of this volume, because we see all of them join forces and kind of create this big body, and then I think Nightcrawler's soul is transported into the body, but then at the end of one of those issues, Wolverine is saying, what did you offer the vamps so that they would help you? And Nightcrawler tells Wolverine, I didn't offer them anything. But then in his thoughts, in the captions, he says that he lost his soul in the process. So I don't know if he's just being melodramatic or if he actually lost his soul, because he was in heaven and he came back to Earth. So it's entirely possible that he did lose his soul. I don't really know. And that's another thing. Since Jason Aaron is leaving the X-Men pretty much for good after this volume, I have no idea if the next writers, Yost and Kyle, if they plan on following this up, or if they're just going to kind of ignore it and they're going to let Chris Claremont follow it up. I don't know if Chris Claremont plans on following that up. I really don't know. It's going to be, there's a lot of things left in the air. I really wish that Jason Aaron had waited 2 more volumes or so to kind of close out some of these plot threads a little bit. Just answer a few more questions. Do the Bamps stick around? Are there still other Bamps hanging out? Or did they all merge and form this new Nightcrawler body that Nightcrawler is now in? Did Nightcrawler actually lose his soul? There's a lot of stuff here. Maybe if I reread those last couple of issues, it would make a little bit more sense to me. And this isn't a bad book. It's really enjoyable. If you like those old X-Men comics where Nightcrawler is having a swashbuckling adventure, like there's one in the 1980s where he saves this princess woman from Arcade. There's another one where Kitty is telling a fairy tale to Ilyana, and that's a very swashbuckling kind of story. This has a lot of sensibilities similar to that, and it's a very fun comic. This also does something where a lot of people may hate it, a lot of people may not. There was an X-Men villain from Chuck Austin's run on Uncanny X-Men called Azazel, and he was a demon who is actually Nightcrawler's father. And people loathed that comic book with a burning passion. And I will go ahead and say that storyline was not very good. But Jason Aaron actually takes that character and he makes use of that character. I'm not going to say that Azazel is like a 3-dimensional fleshed out villain or anything like that, but when you have 50 years of X-Men comics and there's a lot of villains out there that don't get their due, you don't always have to use the same 5 X-Men villains like Mr. Sinister, Apocalypse, and Magneto. Sometimes you can use the minor villains like Azazel. You can use him for a storyline like this. And in this case, it made sense because Azazel, like I said, I did demon in quotes because a lot of people read the Draco, and I guess they just didn't actually read the story. The Draco, I don't know how it's pronounced. They read that story, and I guess they didn't actually read it because a lot of people came away from that thinking that Nightcrawler was half demon, and for a long time that's what I thought until I read the story, and he's not actually a demon. He's, if anything, a really long-lived mutant, and he had actual wars with actual heavenly archangels, but he himself was not a demon. In fact, in this story, he's trying to take over hell. And so if he was a demon, he would have already had hell, or at the very least, he would have had a portion of hell. And so I think Jason Aaron understands that Azazel was actually just a mutant from the planet Earth, and he was really long-lived, and somehow he was banished to another dimension, and that was kind of covered in the events of the Draco, but he's not an actual demon. And this story kind of addresses that. And so if you read the Draco, if you read any of Chuck Austin's run and you really hated it, you might hate this storyline just because it brings back that character. A lot of people, they read that and they instantly said, nope, that didn't happen. I erase it from my mind. That is not part of the X-Men history. And so they're probably not going to like this story as much because it is referencing something that they hated so much that they wanted to erase it from their mind. Chuck Austin's run, not very good, like I said, but if a writer wants to come along and take something from that run that wasn't explained well enough or just didn't work and then make it work a little better, I'm totally fine with that. And so, plus, this is a swashbuckling story with pirates and demons and stuff like that, and it makes sense that you would want to use Azazel for a story like that. This is drawn by Ed McGuinness, who I've always loved his artwork, and here, it reminds me a lot of Nick Bradshaw's work on Wolverine and the X-Men. And since I'm looking at this as kind of a companion series to Jason Aaron's Wolverine and the X-Men, it really makes sense that Ed McGuinness would be drawing this. And his art style is very similar to Bradshaw's. And so I would really love to see him draw some more X-Men. I have no idea if he stuck around after this arc, though. And then the last issue is drawn by someone else. Let me quickly look. Cameron Stewart, who... I think I'm familiar with Stewart's art. I've heard that name before, but here it doesn't look very good. I did not like the art in the last issue here. Part of it is it's very different from McGinnis's artwork. And when you have a trade paperback with two artists and you go from Ed McGinnis, who's very cartoony, to Cameron Stewart, who has more of a sketchy style, it's very jarring for me. It doesn't matter if it's two separate single issues. If you go from issue 5 to issue 6 and you have a different artist in issue 6, for some reason that doesn't bother me. But when you collect those issues together in a trade, it bothers me a lot more if the styles are very different from one artist to another. And Cameron Stewart's style is incredibly different from McGinnis's, but also I think if this whole book had been drawn by Cameron Stewart, I would not have liked it as much. I don't like Stewart's art as much as I do McGinnis's, but it's not mind-blowingly awful. It's just not something that I particularly cared for here. I could talk a little bit more about some other stuff here, but this is a really fun book. If you like Nightcrawler, if you've been angry at the X-Men franchise ever since he died, definitely you need to read this. Nightcrawler is a character who, I like him in small doses. He's not someone who I have to have in the X-Men all the time. He's more a character who, if I saw him in real life, I would want to hang out with him, eat dinner with him, but he's not a very interesting character to read about in large doses in the comics. But just throwing him back into the X-Men in this story was very interesting. And I will probably even read the Nightcrawler solo stuff that Chris Claremont is doing just to kind of see if it picks up where some of these story threads left off here, or if it kind of ignores that and goes its own way. I don't know, but I recommend this. I think it's a very enjoyable book, and sadly, this kind of caps off everything that Jason Aaron was doing in Wolverine and the X-Men, and I did want to talk about something real quick. I mentioned at the very beginning of the video that Nightcrawler shows up at the end of Volume 7 when we see that he is still around, or actually he was in heaven and that he was in contact with one of the Bamfs. And he said something to the effect of, "I'm going to need my friends to help me," or something like that. And I am not entirely sure if that is consistent with what's going on here, because here it seems like Nightcrawler exclusively, he only wanted the X-Men to help him stop Azazel. But at the end of Wolverine and the X-Men, it almost seemed like he needed them to help bring him back to life. And I'm not really sure if that was just me reading into it, or if I went back and read the end of that, if it did actually work with this. Maybe I was just reading it and that was how I was reading into it, but maybe that's not how it was written. I really don't remember. I don't have a whole lot else to say. It is a little odd. I'm not sure where this book takes place, because we know that at the very end of Volume 7, Nightcrawler is saying, "Hey, I'm going to need the X-Men's help." And then at the very end of this book, a little bit of a spoiler, Mystique rescues Azazel from being transported to prison, and she offers him a job. I'm assuming that she's offering him a job with the Hellfire Club, which was taken down at the end of Volume 7. We saw Azazel at the Hellfire Club in Volume 7, I think. Maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe we didn't see him there. We did see him briefly in the Wolverine and the X-Men run, but maybe he wasn't there at the Hellfire Club. I don't really know what Mystique is offering him a job for. Maybe the new Brotherhood of Mutants, because we did see in Jason Aaron's Wolverine and the X-Men run that she was going to be reforming the Brotherhood of Mutants, so maybe she's bringing him into work with the Brotherhood. I don't know. I'm very interested to see if that's another thing that's going to get dropped, or if someone else is going to run with it in a later X-Men book. So if you know, if you've been up to date on X-Men stuff, and you know what's going on with Mystique and Azazel after this volume, let me know. I'm very curious. That I wasn't really sure if that was just kind of a wonky little, doesn't really work, because when I read it, I instantly thought that she was offering him a job with the Hellfire Club, which definitely doesn't make sense, because this is supposed to take place after Wolverine and the X-Men Volume 7, where the Hellfire Club was defeated. So maybe it is something different, and I just don't know about it. That's all I have to say. This has been a little bit of a longer review than normal, but I guess I had more to say than I thought. I hope you guys liked this review, and I hope I was able to convince you to go check this book out. I will see you guys tomorrow with a different kind of review. So until then, I hope you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.